Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Monday, January 13th. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. The Southern California communities of Altadena and Pacific Palisades are facing devastation from wildfires. While we watch in horror from miles away, we're asking, how safe are we from similar fires in the Central Valley?
We need people who live here to become experts in wildland fire behavior.
Coming up, we'll hear from the leader of a local fire safe council about what concerns exist here. But first, today's headlines. Hundreds of Central Valley residents showed up to protests in Bakersfield and Fresno this weekend. They were pushing back after U.S. Border Patrol agents detained dozens of immigrants last week. KVPR's Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado reports from Fresno.
The sudden presence of Border Patrol in the San Joaquin Valley caught many by surprise. Agents have withdrawn for now, but many at this protest are questioning whether farm workers were specifically targeted on their way to work. Flor Martinez Zaragoza says she's ready to support immigrants, especially in the face of a Trump administration that has promised mass deportations.
And of course, protecting our farm workers because they deserve people to be out here standing up for them, and that's exactly what we're seeing here today.
The immigration detainments came too close for comfort for people like Osvaldo, who only wanted to go by his first name for his safety.
I'm a DACA recipient. I'm a dreamer, and it just hits home. My sisters, my mother, they're not from here. They don't have papers, so when you see stuff going on like this, it hits home. These demonstrations are reigniting many immigrant rights activists in the valley, while others say they're picking up the cause for the first time. For KVPR News, I'm Crescencio Rodriguez Delgado.
Advocate groups for immigrants and farm workers are criticizing tactics used by Border Patrol agents in last week's operation. Officials with U.S. Customs and Border Protection said they arrested nearly 80 people in a 3-day operation across the Central Valley. Agents say the arrests were targeted, but they happened mainly in public areas frequented by farm workers. Antonio de Loera Brust is a spokesperson for the United Farm Workers Union. He says many farm workers have slowly returned to fields despite the fear of deportation weighing over them.
If you're having orange juice or orange slices in the days and weeks ahead, it was probably an undocumented worker. Those workers don't care if that orange is going to a Democrat or a Republican's table. They just want to be treated fairly and with dignity and be able to stay with their families in the country that their labor feeds.
Community groups are holding several workshops to inform undocumented immigrants of their legal rights. Drought is making a slow comeback in California. The latest map from the U.S. Drought Monitor shows counties in the San Joaquin Valley are abnormally dry. Many counties in Southern California have reached severe drought status. This is a reversal from wet periods in recent years, but climate experts say this kind of climate whiplash is one of the most pressing challenges the state is facing. Kings County has released its first 5-year report aimed at improving public health. As KVPR's Carrie Klein reports, many health needs in Kings are common throughout the valley.
Chronic disease, maternal and infant health, and food insecurity are among the priorities the Kings County Public Health Department has put in its sights for the next 5 years. That's because the county's mortality and food insecurity rates are higher than the state average. The teenage birth rate is almost twice as high. Here's Kings County's Public Health Director, Rosemary Ran.
It wasn't necessarily a surprise, but to see it quantified on a report was really pretty stark.
And she says the pandemic helped reveal that rural communities tend to be overlooked.
It really reminded us as public health professionals that we needed to be talking to those communities.
Kings County isn't alone with these health needs. Rand says they're collaborating on interventions with Fresno and Madera counties. For KVPR News, I'm Carrie Klein.
Support for Central Valley Daily comes from the members of KVPR. Join at $8 or more per month and access ad-free NPR podcasts through NPR Plus. Give now at kvpr.org/donate.
And now to our main story. The wildfires in Los Angeles County have killed 24 people, decimated homes, and displaced thousands. The images coming from the disaster zones are shocking, and they've left many in other parts of California concerned about potential risks of fire where they live. In Central California, many are drawn to the lush Sierra Nevada foothills. But living and recreating in such a place also comes with a responsibility, now more than ever. So says Ashley Nebeker. She's the executive director of the Eastern Madera County Fire Safe Council. The nonprofit focuses on wildfire prevention and education. Nebeker says as fires become more frequent, residents will need to be informed on fire preparedness and safety. She recently joined me to explain ways to do that.
Number one is going to be actually education. So we're avoiding some of the myths. We find that a lot of people are moving into this landscape that aren't quite prepared with the knowledge that they need to have, as well as people have been living here for their entire lives and have not prepared for the rapid change in climate and the changes of the landscapes that they're experiencing. The fire itself, there's the fire triangle, and we need a perfect picture to be built in order for fire to take hold. And the fire triangle consists of oxygen, heat, and fuel, so a receptive fuel bed. So when we're trying to teach people about wildfire, we need them to start understanding basic wildfire science. And with the landscape and the historical fire events that are happening over the past 10 years in California, we need people who live here to become experts in wildland fire behavior. If you're looking at incidents down south right now, you're going to be seeing a wildfire blowing through in a different type of environment that we might have up here in the woodland forest. And it'll look different down in more flashy fuels down in the foothills, and it would look different if it's coming through the cities and the towns. So people really need to not look at wildland fire through one lens. They have to understand the entire scope. So when we talk to people and their contribution, we ask them to evaluate their defensible space. And in California, we have the PRC 4291, which is the fire code, that in the state responsibility area, we're able to go in and enforce these codes and letting people know that the vegetation within the first 100 feet of their house needs to be in a certain condition in order for firefighters to be able to get in there and potentially save their home. What they are not able to do, though, is, let people know that they have to fix their infrastructure. And that's where we're kind of getting crippled here, is that with the insurance crises, people not being able to insure themselves, they're finding their rates getting so highly increased that it's crippling them from investing in those home hardening, as we call them, efforts, or in those vegetation removals. So we're finding that's a huge problem for local residents.
Yeah, the defensible space, you mentioned the vegetation. What else is important that people know when it comes to home hardening, so to speak? I think these are terms that people hear, but they don't always truly know functionally what they need to do.
Right. So when we talk about a receptive fuel, you look at what people are seeing right now in the Palisades is these fires caught up in foothills. We still do not know the cause of the ignition sources, and it's really bad for us to speculate. But what happened with high winds is they had an ember storm, and that happens quite often in wildfires. That there's a myth that people think a wildfire is going to blow through your grass, come up and touch your house, and that is going to be the ignition source, where quite the opposite. Most of the time, it's an ember storm. So we have a fire that is adjacent, can be up to 2 to 3 miles away if there's enough high winds. And an ember storm will come and ignite receptive fuel beds either within your vegetation or on your house itself. And the most kind of what we see is not everybody has enough money to go and build a brand new house, right? So we try to prioritize what we ask people to take care of. And that's when we're looking at our gutters. They get loaded up with debris, over the summer. They get nice, crispy, and dry, and a wildfire will come along and it will get into those gutters, and that will be the ignition source. Also, vents, eaves, or down below in basements. When a lot of these homes were built, we're talking 80s, maybe even before, we didn't have the building codes that there are now, where we need to see vents that are like 1/8 of an inch or less small. Or we also have honeycomb vents that'll close now in the event of an ember storm. But embers will enter the attics and enter basements through vents. So everything, all these prescriptions and these recommendations, they're science-based. They're not a what if. It's like if the fire comes, when it comes, this is where it's going to ignite.
You mentioned people are moving into these beautiful spaces and not understanding what they need to do to be prepared. What are some communities that are particularly at risk in eastern Madera County, or where you're seeing more issues?
Gosh, is there a particular county? Honestly, there's not a particular county. With the changes that we've had in the just the rapid increase in wildfires, we aren't anyone. Essentially, what we're looking at in a high fire severity district is anybody who's kind of up north side of the Madera Canal, because that's when we start to see people owning acreage, right? So that's one of the big issues that we see is people move up here to get into these woodland forested areas because they're, like you said, they're beautiful. But with that comes the responsibility to maintain your private land. A lot of language and comments that we see online right now when we're watching people, try to place blame on one thing for these fires starting. People say this wouldn't happen, if we had better forest management. A lot of fires wouldn't happen if we had better fire management in those woodland areas. But we also have federal responsibility areas. We have the state responsibility areas, and then we have private lands that are owned up in these forested woodlands. And if people aren't doing their duty to mitigate the hazards on their property, they are the risk to the forested areas, not vice versa.
That's interesting because I know a common concern has been that forest and brush management perspective. Some folks have said the governor, our state, has not been doing enough to protect residents. But it sounds like from your point of view, it's incumbent upon everyone interacting with these areas to be fire safe aware.
Absolutely. I mean, we are definitely, without a doubt, we are handicapped in regards to how quickly we can get work done in forested lands. Well, we will partner with federal and state, and we will do projects on federal land and on state land, but we are handicapped by a lot of red tape and environmental tape. And sometimes well-meaning environmental regulations, what they end up doing is preventing us from getting emergency work done. So that is a facet. I will not say that that does not play a massive part. We cannot get work done fast enough. There's not enough money, and there's too many roadblocks for us to get this work done quickly enough. And if that does not change really rapidly, we're going to be in some bad shape. And that's, regulations that come, they're separate. You've got regulations that come from forest land and from the federal government, and you have regulations that come from the state. So we do need the state to step up and release some of these regulations so we can protect the forest that it's a lot cart before the horse when you want to try to protect something that needs restoration first.
That was my conversation with Ashley Nebeker. She's the executive director of the Eastern Madera County Fire Safe Council. And that does it for today's show. Today's episode was produced by Carrie Klein, Jonathan Linden, and KVPR, with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. I'm Elizabeth Arkalian. Find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.